Hi, I'm Troy Stangerone, Senior Director and Fellow here at the Korea Economic Institute. Welcome to the launch of our new survey on U.S. attitudes towards the Korean Peninsula. This is our third annual survey conducted in cooperation with YouGov. We initially launched the survey in 2020. We engaged in this survey work to try and gauge the U.S. public's opinions and attitudes to a wide range of issues pertaining to Korea, from trade to pop culture to security issues. It's another way that KEI works to reach beyond the Beltway and to hear from everyday Americans. To review your findings, we are joined today by three experts to touch on trade, pop culture, and security issues in three distinct sessions. Each section will begin with our guest speaker and then a moderated discussion. And finally, a brief Q&A to address audience questions. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat function visible on your device. Now I'd like to turn to our first session. We are fortunate today to have with us former South Korean Trade Minister Ya Han-koo, who is joining us from South Korea. Minister Ya capped off almost 3 decades of public service as Trade Minister of the Republic of Korea in the final year of the Moon Jae-in administration, and is currently a non-resident Distinguished Fellow of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Trade Minister Ya, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thanks for having me, Troy.
Before we take a look at some of the polling data, I wanted to talk with you about U.S.-Korea relations in general. Until the recent change in administrations, you served in the Moon administration. As a former trade minister, what do you see as some of the key components of the relationship with the United States?
First of all, I'd like to thank KEI for this very interesting and informative the poll and for organizing this the webinar today. Let me start off by bringing up President Biden's recent visit to SK Silcheon, which was appeared yesterday in many of Korea's newspapers. I think that visit really symbolized the current status of Korea-U.S. bilateral trade and economic relations, and also the future direction that we should be going. And in fact, about the last May, myself and the USGR, the Ambassador Catherine Tai, we have visited the factory to celebrate the 10th year anniversary of Koros FTA. The reason why we chose this factory as a special occasion was that it really shows, the future of Koros FTA. I mean, for the last 10 years, our bilateral trade, thanks to the Koros FTA, it expanded about 70%, and investment, it really exploded 250%. And having said that, I think now our bilateral economic relations is really being upgraded into this high-tech, supply chain alliance from just the military alliance. So I think the core component of our bilateral relations is that we are transforming ourselves from this quantitative expansion of our trade relations into more high quality, high tech, and then supply chain cooperation and partnership. And then I remember that, during the speech, President Biden had emphasized that American manufacturing and supply chain are coming back to the United States. And I think Korean businesses are contributing to make that happen with their, this high quality investment. In this, going back to this poll, I think it's really encouraging that 66% of Americans and 85% of Americans following this Asia Pacific news, consider this trade with Korea as positive, especially in the midst of this, pandemic and also sort of anti-trade sentiment. So I think this is really encouraging.
No, I think that's a great point. And when we look back even at our earlier surveys, even going back to during the Trump administration when, President Trump obviously had his own concerns about trade with South Korea. One of the things that we saw is that the U.S. public, however, was strongly in support of trade with South Korea. So I think, that's a great point to bring up. So since you've had a chance to, look through some of the survey data, was there anything in there that perhaps, surprise you about the U.S. public's priorities? And are there, any results that you would like to perhaps, highlight?
I think that as you mentioned, kind of surprising, the aspect was that despite this overall, the protectionist and sort of turbulent global environment that the world is facing, Americans seem to see this Korea-U.S. these bilateral trade relations from more, forward-looking and then more positive aspect. So I think it really shows a bright future that our two countries are going to have in the future. And I think partly because of all these recent investment, announcement and the actual investment happening, from Korea to many of these the state in the U.S., Alabama, Georgia, Michigan, and South Carolina and the Louisiana. So I think these Korean investment are all over the place in the United States, and I think that is also positively impacting the perception of average Americans towards this trade with Korea and also this investment relation with Korea.
I think you're right. I used to work on Capitol Hill for a member of the U.S. Senate, and one thing that I like to try and, remind people is that, for everyone, things are local. And, as we see more Korean investment, trade with Korea is much more real for the average American. My home state, LG Chem recently announced about a week ago they were going to put a new battery facility in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. There's cooperation with Ford building their mega facility between, I want to say it's SK, but I may be wrong on that off the top of my head. So we're seeing a lot of this take place, on the ground. You've highlighted, the strong support the U.S. public has for trade with South Korea. So I'm kind of wondering, do you think that opens up the possibilities for collaboration in other areas potentially?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think mostly, these average American consumers are familiar with this, electronic gadget from Korea, like cellular phone and the TV, washing machine. And also, more and more, I think many American consumers are, buying these Korean electric vehicles, and also this equipped with this, Korean battery. So I think starting from this electronics and mobile ICT sector, I think it's really expanding towards, for example, bio or pharma. I think during the pandemic, this Pfizer, not Pfizer, but Moderna, for example, and then Novavax, they really formed, partnership with the SK and Samsung. So I think this really expanding in terms of scope and coverage of this trade and investment relation between two countries.
So one of the things that we look at in the survey actually is sort of what the American public kind of would like to see the U.S. and Korea cooperate more on. And, you've raised this issue of supply chains, which clearly during the pandemic has been a very important issue and something on everyone's minds. You've also talked about how, the United States is working to try and rebuild its manufacturing capacity and the important role South Korea is playing in that part of the supply chain question for the United States. If we look at supply chains, though, this actually is the issue that most Americans support cooperation with. And I think we have the slide up right now. 55% of Americans support cooperating with South Korea on supply chains. It's within the margin of error within the poll, like the North Korea one. So basically, supply chains in North Korea are the top issues. But I think, if we look at this, the supply chain issue is bipartisan. But some of the other issues on there, if we look at, for example, climate change and global health, and you mentioned, the cooperation between Moderna and Novavax with South Korea, unfortunately, there isn't necessarily a lot of support for these types of cooperations. So I guess one thing I'd like to ask is, are you concerned that some areas the U.S. and Korea are looking to cooperate in, that perhaps this public support that's maybe more partisan rather than bipartisan could be a challenge in the future?
I think that, as you mentioned, Troy, this supply chain is really critical matter to both United States and Korea. For example, in 2001, when in the midst of this pandemic, during this presidential summit, many Korean businesses announced almost about 40 billion dollars of investment in the United States in the semiconductor, batteries, EV, and bio, etc. So, and for example, semiconductor, Samsung is investing in Texas, and then batteries, for example, as you mentioned, there are about 14 new battery factories are being built in the United States by 2025. And 11 out of the 14 are covering about 70% of new capacity to be deployed in the United States, are being built by Korea or Korea-U.S. joint venture. So I think we can say that the supply chain cooperation between Korea and United States are really interconnected and indispensable to each other. So in light of this, ongoing G2 tension and also more and more of this techno-nationalistic, sentiment around the world, I think Korea and United States, we share the same value, and we are ironclad military alliance, plus really upgrading our bilateral relations to the supply chain and the high-tech alliance. So I'm not too much worried about, the supply chain, cooperation between our two countries.
And I am glad that you've stressed a lot the EV battery side. I think one thing that maybe many Americans don't realize, and you gave the numbers on the Korean battery investment in the United States, but that as we try to transition to electric vehicles here in the U.S., this is largely going to be because of our partners in South Korea who will be providing the batteries to many, if not most, of these vehicles. It's not just going to be in Korean cars. I know there's issues with the Inflation Reduction Act, but Ford, GM, Chrysler, all of them are partnering to an extent with different Korean companies, and so even U.S. manufacturers are going to be working closely with South Korean companies.
Right, that's correct.
So before we turn to any questions from the audience, I have one last question I'd like to ask you. What would Korea, or what do you think, maybe people in Korea would like to see more of in the U.S. Korea trade relationship?
Yeah, I think, as I said, our bilateral trade relations has continued to develop, transform ourselves, and upgrade towards, more high quality and this more sophisticated this bilateral relations. And I think that the world is facing these global challenges, such as the supply chain disruption, climate change, and then this technology decoupling, etc. So I think Korea and United States, building on our 10-year experience of Coral FTA, successful implementation of Coral FTA, I think we have really good potential to work together to cope with all these global challenges together. For example, this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, I think this is really ambitious and meaningful, this initiative to develop new rules of the game in the Asia Pacific, and then forge really more stable, more resilient the network of cooperation in the Asia Pacific region. And I think Korea and United States, as really mature partners, building on this 10-year Coral FTA, I think we can really step up and work together as leaders in the region to really find the more stable and the more stable economic architecture in the Indo-Pacific region.
So if you don't mind, before we turn to any other questions, I do, since you raised the Indo-Pacific framework, wonder. So there's four pillars within the framework. The trade pillar, which focuses a lot on supply chains, climate change, digital trade, and then anti-corruption. We've obviously talked a lot about supply chains, so I don't necessarily want to go back through that. But on digital trade and climate change, are there any things that perhaps you think are key areas for the U.S. and Korea to perhaps focus their efforts on?
Yes, I think supply chain, as I mentioned, not just semiconductor battery like this high tech industry, but also this commodity raw materials, rare earths. In this kind of all the supply chain, there's a big synergy that we can create together between through our bilateral relations and also digital trade. Korea is really trying to lead in the region with, for example, DPA and this bilateral this partnership with the leading countries, and also this climate change. Korea has put forward one of the most ambitious NDC goal the last year, and in the process of decarbonizing our economy and developing this new clean energy source, hydrogen power, and then all this renewable energy. I think there's a lot to do together between Korea and United States in the public as well as the private sector. So I see this IPEF as really crucial undertaking, and I think our two countries can closely work together for this.
Who worked with me on the survey, and to be honest, we wouldn't be able to do this without Andy's help. He provides a lot of support on this project. And so, Andy, do you have any questions for Trade Minister Yeo?
On these kinds of areas where rules may be ill-defined, maybe nascent, and I know we mentioned things like IPEF. I'm also thinking of things like the Artemis Accords, where South Korea is a signatory, and now in areas like space, rules are currently being developed, but they're not necessarily there, and we're seeing a lot of potential for growth in those areas like the low Earth economy or things like digital trade and the metaverse. I was wondering how Korea and the United States could cooperate better to be better rule setters in these spaces where we're seeing industry grow more and more.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great question. I think rule setting is important, but also implementing and enforcing the rule is important. And when you have this experience of is implementing the high standard rule you have made, you can make better. You can do better job of this rule setting. So in that sense, I continue. Coming back to this point of this 10-year experience of KOROS FTA, the United States. This experience not only to Korea but also to the United States. I think this is very unique and valuable asset because I think probably this is the only experience that United States have with this major industrial power in the Asia Pacific. And also this very high standard of the rule of KOROS FTA and implementing it for 10 years through trial and errors, and then continue to improve the rule. I think that's a very, very valuable experience. So in that sense, I believe that Korea and the United States have a lot of experience that have worked together already, and that we can collaborate in developing all these new emerging rules that you have mentioned.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Minister. Yeah. And I actually want to turn to an audience question from our non-resident fellow, Terrence Matsuo, who asked a question to a topic that's actually very near and dear to my heart. He asks, given Korea's growing defense industry, could you describe maybe opportunities for U.S. ROK cooperation in that space?
Mm-hmm. I'm not an expert on this defense industry, but actually, recently this defense industry in Korea is really growing, and Recently we saw in the newspaper that the Korea is exporting the defense materials to Poland, for example, and then I think also there's this Korea-U.S. military cooperation in supporting this arsenal to Ukraine. So obviously, I think industry is a very promising area, and I think there's a kind of competitive advantage that each of our own countries have in this broader scope of defense industry. So yes, I think this is promising area.
Right. Thank you so much, Minister. Yeah, Troy, I'm not sure if you had any parting thoughts and questions.
Well, I think this has been a great discussion. Trey Bishia, I know it's late there. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us today and look forward to seeing you in the future as we work on other initiatives together. And with that, I'd like to we move on to our second session with Jenna Gibson. And Andy, you'll be taking over.
Of course. Thank you for that, Troy. Now, for our second session, we turn to Miss Jenna Gibson, who is also joining us from South Korea. Thank you so much. I know it is a late hour. Jenna is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. In the subfield of international relations, her research interests include foreign policy rhetoric, public and cultural diplomacy, South Korean politics and social issues, and U.S. Korea relations. She was, of course, also a communications director with KEI. Welcome back, Jenna. It is always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks so much for inviting me to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is soft power and, of course, Hallyu. I'm really happy to be here.
We're very happy that you can be with us today. And just to start the morning off with a very simple question, I was wondering if you could define for us what is successful soft power and how do states translate soft power?
Yes, a very simple question, right? I think a lot of ministries of foreign affairs or the State Department would love to have the answer to that question definitively, but I'll give it a shot. For people who may or may not be aware, soft power is defined as a country being able to get the political outcomes it wants in international relations without forced coercion. So we usually contrast this with hard power, or in more traditional IR circles, just power, because hard power is power to a lot of people. The hard power would be things like military, economy. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, though, that this all ties back to international relations and politics, right? So when you're talking about successful soft power, one of the aspects that sometimes goes missing in these conversations is to what end? What's the goal, right? So when we're talking about Hallyu, when we're talking about Korean pop culture for the next, for minutes and hopefully in the future, that's one thing I always want to bring it back to is what's the goal, right? What's the purpose of gaining more popularity through these pop culture acts? So I think I would start there.
Great. Thank you for that. I think it's a great refresher for everyone. So I think this year, especially, I'm sure as many of us both here and our viewers today would note, over the last year, there was a lot of discussion about how pop culture, specifically for South Korea, was helping develop South Korea's soft power. So from your discussion with the survey, have you found that South Korea has reached the mainstream for the United States, or is it still niche for most Americans?
Yeah, I definitely think it's still niche, right? Certainly, when you look at the survey, I think perfect. The results show some interesting trends, right? You do see the arrows on a lot of these are going upwards. That's a great trend. You do see more Americans in this survey, and it seems also, in conversations online, in the mainstream media in the United States, there's just so much more attention to these big, pop culture properties like Squid Game, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit more later, I'm sure, but you do see an increasing trend. But then if you look at that bottom part, where there's still 67% of people, at least on the survey, who said that they haven't seen any of those things. So even though you do see a spike, we go from obviously 0 for Squid Game because it came out this year, 20%. That's a significant number. That's not nothing, but you do have to look at it in the broader context of the American public as a whole may or may not have viewed some of these properties. So I do think there's a good trend and we're going in the right direction. But there is kind of this gap between people who are really into it and maybe are fans of multiple of these things or have viewed multiple of these things and the broader public. Now, the second question, going back to what I just was talking about, is what does that have to do with soft power, though? And that, I think the story is maybe a little bit better in the sense that in order for South Korea, again, it depends on the goal, right? Is the goal to have 100% of Americans view a Korean artist, movie, TV show, or is the goal to have a certain, core group of people who are interested enough to keep coming back to it to learn more, those kinds of things. So I think if we're looking at it in terms of soft power, I actually don't see necessarily a problem with a number like 67% not having seen these things, because that, 30-ish percent, 33%, maybe viewing significant amounts or be more interested in other aspects of Korea, going back to the goal of gaining more soft power.
So, Jenna, if you don't mind if I jump in here a question, I have sort of a follow-up question that I'd like to ask you. And you and I had kind of over email talked about this a little bit before, but we also live in a different environment today too. So, you said 67% not having seen. How much do you think also the fact that we live in a media environment to where everything is split? You have, small numbers of people going to multiple things. Network TV now, hit shows have maybe like 5 million viewers a night. So nobody is really sitting down like, to be honest, when I was younger and Friends and ER and things were on and they were getting like 40 or 50 million people a night. So in that context, even at 67% not having seen it, is that maybe for the environment we're in really good output then for South Korea in terms of access to the U.S. in terms of who's seen the content, given the context that we're actually like in today?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I would also say that there's maybe an outsized cultural influence too to something like Squid Game in particular, where people may or may not have seen it, or they may have not watched the entire thing themselves, but there were so many references, parodies, things like that, where people have probably seen like the Halloween costumes even. The secondary or tertiary aspects certainly went beyond just the people who may have actually sat down and watched the thing itself, which again to me is maybe showing even more influence rather than just saying, okay, we need to make sure that everybody has seen these particular things, which, as you point out, Troy, is maybe not even possible anymore, even for like very mainstream, US based companies. So that is a really good point. And I think we can, maybe be a little more kind with numbers like 67% having not seen Korean content. Like I said, that's still pretty good. I think that's really good. And about, 5 or 10 years ago, we would be nowhere near those numbers anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about like things like the Halloween costume. I was actually reading a New York Times article yesterday about how, despite Avatar being the biggest grossing movie of all time, it's had virtually zero cultural impact. So, I think some of these issues, the context is maybe hard to understand sometimes.
Right, of course, and I think you bring up an excellent point, especially with terms of Squid Game and the kinds of impact it has, and actually, in fact, because of the kinds of viewership and the impact that we observed with Squid Game for this year's survey, we commissioned a special set of questions specifically regarding Squid Game, and we'll look at some of the data now, and of course, we see a quarter of Americans, having heard of it and watched it. That is a number that we haven't seen for a lot of other medias. We've been running questions on pop culture for a long time now. But now, Jenna, you mentioned earlier about the kinds of impact that this has, and I think it's worth mentioning. Seeing how this actually changed how Americans view South Korea or find interest in South Korean culture. I was wondering if you saw, I guess, looking specifically at Squid Game, what kinds of impact we've observed.
Yeah, so I think one thing that has been quite an interesting trend is properties like Parasite, for example. Parasite and Squid Game, to me, have a lot of similarities, right? They kind of came out of nowhere in terms of, the American understanding of Korean pop culture, at least. They have very similar themes of inequality, of injustice, of some violent aspects as well. So it's been really, for me at least, as someone who's been a fan of Korean pop culture for a while, to see how first Parasite and then Squid Game tapped into some really universal themes, but then brought a very specifically Korean story along with it. And so I think that is one reason, in my opinion, why it has, number one, become so popular, and people have been so interested in it and have wanted to discuss afterwards, right? It's not just, oh, this, let's watch this and move on. There's actually been some really interesting cultural discussions about it, about those themes, and about the Koreanness of Squid Game as well. The hot takes were flying for a while. I'm sure you guys saw. But I wonder if that's also part of why it has maybe driven more interest in things like, interest in Korean pop culture, becoming more interested, or wanting to gain more knowledge about the broader themes or the broader like social issues that were specifically brought up in Squid Game. The thing that's interesting to me, though, is that some people had a more favorable view of Korea after watching this like pretty negative depiction of Korean society, right? Underneath the bright colors, I mean, this is a very dark story. And Parasite was very similar too. And even, some of the other, especially movies that have come out are quite dark. And, it resonates with people, but it's not necessarily something where it's like, oh, this is great for the image of Korea, right? So that's the part that I'm really fascinated by is, it's generating for at least 23% of people a more favorable view of Korea, despite all those negative themes that came out.
I think you nailed it right on the head there, Jenna. And now zooming back out, honestly, we've seen these kinds of impacts and tried to observe how, as we talked about, how pop culture kind of translates into these shaping opinions, at least among the American public, about how they view South Korea. And now zooming back out a little bit, I want to bring our attention over to our observations across the board about how being a fan of South Korean pop culture products, which of course encompasses a large variety of things, not just streaming, but also music, beauty products, and kind of seeing how that translates into interest in language, culture, history, politics. I was wondering, you know, from your observations, for those who consume these cultural products, what were most likely to produce greater interest in other areas, or did you see any shifts in how people view South Korea in these different aspects?
Yeah, so this is this is my favorite slide, my favorite like part of the survey, because this is what I was talking about at the beginning. I personally, as someone who studies soft power, someone who's interested in that translation of popularity into impact, right? This is what I'm talking about is even if you only have, 25, 30%, you have 1/3 of people who have viewed a South Korean pop culture product, for example. What have they done? What have those 33% done with it, right? If among the people who say that they're fans, what has that inspired them to do additionally? And, you can see on this slide, there's interesting trends. I'll just point out a couple, but I think one should like go take a look at this survey, take a look at these numbers. It's really interesting. Before I looked at it like in detail, I would have expected that movies would be the most. And I'm not sure if that's because of, my stereotype of the type of people who watch, foreign movies. They might be more interested in these things to begin with. But one thing that I find really fascinating is that it seems like it's actually dramas that are the highest across these categories. So if you look at the second column all the way down, generally you see quite high numbers amongst people who are watching or who are fans of dramas. And I wonder, there's probably a lot of things going on there, but dramas, there's a wide variety of them. A lot of them have very historical themes or take place in historical times. So maybe that's driving the slightly higher numbers on the Korean history aspect, people watching that and wanting to know more about that part of history. And maybe the fact that it's a little bit longer than a movie, there's more content that people can get interested in and engage with. Etc. So I thought it would have been the movies would be like significantly higher, but it's pretty steady across the board. It seems like from music to dramas to movies, with maybe dramas being a little bit higher in some of the categories. The thing that I also found really interesting is it's, depending on exactly which category you're talking about, beauty products is actually driving more interest than I would have expected as well. Just because it doesn't necessarily have an explicit tie to language or history or other things that you directly see when you're watching a Korean drama or when you're listening to Korean music. There's a more natural tendency to want to like learn the language so you can understand what's going on, or look at what's up with this like costume, in this historical drama, things like that. There's a natural link there, but with K-beauty, there isn't as much of a natural link, which I think is why some of the numbers are lower, but it's still driving interest in other aspects of Korean culture. And I think that's really fascinating. And yeah, that would be something that I would want to know more about and would want to follow up with if I had the chance to talk to some of these fans.
Absolutely. And I actually did want to bring it back to an interesting point, a fascinating point that you made about how dramas seem to have had a greater impact than movies. And I think it relates earlier to what we were discussing about how a lot of media consumption has become more personalized in recent times. And I wanted to ask you, I guess, more related to just pop culture dissemination, the impact that social media and streaming has had, and whether South Korean media products and pop culture has met a good time, in that there's all this media that specifically targets people who are more inclined to be interested.
Yeah, I would say that I guess there's two things going on. First thing is luck, right? The luck of, being in the right place at the right time, having, the impact of social media. Social media is taking off, especially Twitter. YouTube, like we couldn't watch music videos whenever we wanted 15, 20 years ago, right? So having a place where you can go and watch like high quality, interesting music videos was just a game changer for K-pop and the music industry in general. So one aspect is the luck and the timing, but the other aspect is the fact that the industry was right there ready to take that luck and take that timing and go for it, right? They invested in technologies. They were right there when YouTube was becoming big, putting out really flashy, really well-produced music videos. Dramas, for example, were making deals with Netflix to really get that globalization, get on those platforms. And yeah, so I think that there's one aspect of, certainly there's luck going on and good timing, but there are other industries that didn't see that opportunity in quite the same way that I think the Korean entertainment industry has just really gone for it and taken some big swings and gotten a lot out of it in the end. And yeah, so I think that's a lot of what's going on. The other thing I will just mention briefly, and this is a whole other topic, is just the way that fans can find each other and can find community through places like Twitter, through places, even YouTube, or sharing these kinds of videos with each other in group chats and things like that. The fact that it's so easy to create a community is partially why I think it's not just something where you're a passive fan or you're a passive viewer, but you truly are, actively involved in a lot of cases if you're, a hardcore fan of these things.
Hey, Jenna, I'd like to do a quick follow-up with you because you've talked about how, the technology is there and people leaned into it, but also that Korean dramas were sort of what, are really driving people to have more interest in Korea in different types of categories. So there's one clear thing I think that stands out to me, so I'd be curious your thoughts, which is the partnership between Netflix and Korean actors and producers. Because now you have this massive global platform who, Netflix has actually invested a lot in. I mean, it's like 500 million a year ago they did in Korean dramas. So how do you think that relationship, and this kind of touches on, what Trey Michelle was talking about before, in terms of collaboration between the United States and South Korea in different industries. So how do you kind of see that partnership?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see. And I think part of it has been a little bit of diversification as well in the terms of the Korean entertainment industry, for example. They had a lot of Chinese investment prior to, 2016, 2017. We had the whole FAB thing. We don't need to get into that. After a lot of that was going on, I think the Korean entertainment industry, especially the drama industry, realized that they needed a, wider array of investments. They had maybe they just needed to branch out a little bit and not put all their eggs into one or two baskets in terms of their globalization strategy. And working with Netflix has been very fruitful, I think, for both sides. The other interesting thing in terms of timing as well, and why this has also been particularly great for Netflix, is because during COVID, a lot of production shut down around the world. A lot of production, especially in the United States, there was a good amount of time where there was just everything was completely shut down. Right? We didn't have new content coming out from at least big production houses. But in Korea, they were able to have some mitigation strategies, and they were able to continue to produce content very quickly, very well-produced, high-quality content at a time when there's like kind of nothing else, or there's little else, right? And at a time when everybody's home looking for content, right? So the partnerships between the Korean drama industry, for example, and Netflix were already established and were growing. But I think once COVID hit, it just completely skyrocketed. And I think from here on out, we will see that trend continue.
Thank you. Right. Well, thank you so much, Jenna. And just a reminder to our viewers that the survey report has been posted on our chat. You can access it through our link or directly on our website at keia.org. There you'll find our samples, cross-section, size, and all the other slides that will be helpful for your viewing. And Jenna, just finally, lightning round question. Zooming back out, after all we've discussed, after all we've looked at, how should we conceive pop culture as this vehicle, this metric for soft power, among other aspects of soft power?
Again, such a good question, and I wish I had a really easy answer for you. But I think the takeaway that I have, or the thing that I always like to come back to, is to remember that its popularity is not soft power, and that popularity in and of itself, or having a lot of people view something, is interesting. And I think it's really fascinating to see, especially the changes or the growth in how much Americans are consuming this kind of content from South Korea. But the stuff that I would have people focus on is the slides like this one, where you're looking at what is actually coming out of that viewership and how that's translating into interest in other aspects that might be a little bit more directly linked to the original purpose of soft power, which is giving South Korea more influence on the world stage in an international relations kind of more political sense, rather than just saying, Korea is popular, therefore they have soft power. It's a little more complicated than that.
Well, thank you so much, Jenna, for your time and, of course, for contextualizing a lot of these different moving parts and really putting context and more meat on the bones to the data that we have here. So we really want to thank you for coming on and taking time to explain that to us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks, Jenna. Great seeing you. Well, we'd now like to transition to our final session on the alliance in North Korea. And for that, we're glad to have Dr. Andrew Yeh here. Andrew is a senior fellow and the SK Korea chair in Korean studies at Brookings. He's also a professor at Catholic University and a longtime friend and colleague of mine in KEI is here. So Andrew, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here live on stage with you, Troy.
Well, and it's great to have you here for our first event on our new stage as well. So thank you. So I'd like to start, you've had a chance to review the survey data and everything. From your perspective, looking at the data, how does the American public see South Korea in terms of its importance as a partner for the United States?
Right. Well, first, let me thank you for inviting me here and also for fielding this survey, which is tremendously useful for researchers like myself. And I'll be sure to cite some of the statistics there. So let me just start with a survey that, with some of the questions that point to the U.S. Korea alliance and the relationship. So 64% believed in the importance of the military alliance between the U.S. and South Korea. And when you look at the breakdown in samples, this jumps to about 80% for those who follow international news, and the trend has grown from 21 to 22. And also 59% of Americans want to maintain or increase U.S. forces troop levels, and this goes up to 70% for those who follow, over 70% for those who follow international news for the Asia Pacific. And so these are pretty robust numbers. So I think there's three implications from your survey about the relationship or the standing between U.S. In U.S.-South Korea alliance. And the first is that the alliance is very robust and Americans are generally supportive of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And the second, which is not from the survey, but just from what I know from other surveys, is that it's reciprocated by Koreans. So there was a Pew Research Center survey earlier this year, which indicated that 80% of South Koreans see the U.S. as a reliable partner. And so that's a good thing that there's relative reciprocity in terms of how we feel about Koreans and the alliance and how Koreans feel about the U.S. and the U.S. alliance. Also, the support for troops in South Korea is interesting because we've seen or heard voices for foreign policy restraint growing over the years. I think this grew really under the Trump administration. But the surveys don't suggest this. There's actually more support for U.S. troops. So perhaps that effect, the phenomena of foreign policy restraint, may have not come up to the level of public opinion. So yeah, I think there's a lot of good things that we can get out of several of the survey questions.
So on your last point, that actually raises something interesting for me in that I've seen some people argue, this restraint question in South Korea, but oftentimes they'll reference polling that is more general, like should the United States be more restrained in the world? Mm-hmm. They won't actually reference a poll specifically after the American public. In this case, do you believe we should, have troops there and be supportive? And so I think there are a lot of issues when you ask the U.S. public, this is probably true of as well. If you ask them generally speaking, they might have one perspective, but when you get into the details of, well, okay, in this case, what do you think? They would have a different perspective. And I think we see this with the U.S.-South Korea military relationship or security partnership. And I think that's important to keep in mind that I think in a broad sense, after 2 decades of Iraq and Afghanistan, yes, Americans want the U.S. to be more restrained, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they view a partnership like South Korea as one to where we should not continue to be supportive.
Yeah, and I also think there's been a change in the rhetoric. If you hear the Biden administration, they talk a lot about supporting alliances, multilateral institutions, and so that may have a priming effect, at least for a certain demographic of the U.S. to think that, well, alliances are actually a good thing, especially when we see, the world falling apart in certain regions.
Yeah, and I mean, even setting aside maybe that demographic, if we don't have on the slide this year like the partisan breakdown, but I mean, when you have 60% or more of Americans support of something, that tells you that there's broad bipartisan support as well. So I mean, this is something I think that's very broadly shared in the U.S. Well, One of the things that I think has been perhaps a factor that might change people's views on things is we obviously know this year Russia invaded Ukraine, and that's made security, a prime issue for people. So, from your perspective, how has that impacted the geopolitical climate around the Korean Peninsula?
Yeah, sure. So I think you're absolutely correct about the Russian invasion and how that's changed some people's thinking about the way we look at international politics and security relationships. On the first question about this geopolitical climate, at the broadest level, I think it's changed in two ways. First, we're seeing deeper linkages and a rekindling across three autocrats. So Putin, Xi, and Kim. I think since Russia's invasion, we've talked a lot about China-Russia alignment, but I think we can also throw North Korea and Kim Jong-un in there as well too. The second geopolitical impact is that I think a lot more people are thinking about the possibility of China invading Taiwan. And that's Taiwan has gotten a lot of attention as well too. But we have this heightened sense of conflict since the invasion of Ukraine, and even on the Korean Peninsula, there's a lot more questions here in Washington about what role South Korea should play in a Taiwan Strait contingency. And I think in some ways that's a manifestation of the conflict in Ukraine, and it's gotten policy planners, but also maybe the public too, to think a little bit more about conflict.
So, when we look at the broader geopolitical situation, though, given the data that we just talked about, earlier on in terms of support for U.S. troops, you would agree, though, that despite the war in Ukraine, there hasn't really been a shift in support for South Korea amongst the U.S. public.
No, it's stayed pretty steady, and if anything, the support has gone up in some ways because in Korea too, there's more attention to defense and deterrence. It's not just because of Ukraine, but we've seen North Korea. I mean, we haven't talked about North Korea yet and how they've also been much more active this past year too. So yeah, we haven't seen that decline in support for the U.S.
So why don't we switch to North Korea then? I mean, it's clearly one of the big security topics. You mentioned Pew Research. I want to bring in the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. They released a poll back in November showing that there's dwindling interest in North Korea among the U.S. public. In our data, Americans still see North Korea as the third largest foreign policy challenge for the United States, whereas those who follow Asia Pacific news saw North Korea as though dramatically lower in terms of importance for foreign policy challenges. So is this a temporary result? Maybe perhaps because up until, and we should say, the survey was done, September. So just before maybe North Korea kind of started really ramping things up. But do you think this is more of a sort of temporary trend, or do you think this is a broader shift maybe we're seeing on U.S. views?
Yeah, so I also looked at the timing of the survey. I know October is really when things started ramping up for North Korea provocations. Of course, they've been firing missiles all year, but that gets to some of the points that you wanted to raise, and that is there North Korea fatigue, or have we just become numb to North Korea provocations? They do it so often. So I think there's some of that effect, and of course, North Korea is an easy target to beat up on because they're universally disliked by. I wouldn't say universally. I guess they have buddies in Putin and Xi, but in the United States at least, they're a pretty easy target. But there's a bigger villain as well too now these days, and that's Putin and maybe Xi as well. And so that might be taking some of the attention away from North Korea. So that would suggest more of a temporary blip, and then we may go back. So it's really hard to say whether this is temporary or we're seeing more of a secular shift away from North Korea being seen as a threat. But it'd be great if there was another survey. I know these are very expensive; you can't field one anytime soon. But if that has changed at all because of the escalations that North Korea has committed, especially if they conduct the 7th nuclear test.
Yeah, and I think this is something that's important for both people looking at surveys and the general public to keep in mind as well when they look at the data, is that these are snapshots in time. What the American public thought at a certain time, and so we've had some lag and everything here with the North Korea situation. And I mean, one of the things we hope, this is our third survey. Once we start getting into the fifth, the sixth, you can start actually seeing trends from those slices in time because we do this at the same point each year. But so I think there is that important contextual context as well to keep in mind when we look at this.
I agree.
So another thing I want to talk about going to North Korea is, so there's a strong desire amongst the U.S. public that North Korea shouldn't have nuclear weapons. So even if this isn't perhaps the priority at the moment, what we've seen, and this has been sort of consistent through the data, is that the U.S. public doesn't support North Korea having a nuclear weapon. Does this help U.S. policymakers pressure North Korea, or does this hinder policymakers' ability to develop a more stable relationship because this is the one thing the U.S. public focuses on about North Korea? And so it's sort of like that situation. Well, if we haven't got rid of the nukes, how can we do the other things with them?
Well, if I'm to be honest, I think policymakers they may not pay too much attention to what the public thinks on these issues, but realistically, the U.S. public's not going to say North Korea should have nuclear weapons, especially because of the media narrative surrounding North Korea as a rogue regime. In that sense, elites and the public are aligned in their views about North Korea and whether they should have nuclear weapons. And so for leaders, U.S. leaders, it means there's very little domestic cost for them to pursue I think, denuclearization. So in that sense, it could be helpful, but I'm not sure if policymakers actually think this way. On the flip side, though, of whether it would hinder policymakers' ability to develop stable relations, I mean, that's a interesting proposition, because if the basis for improved relations means moving away from denuclearization and pushing forward engagement or tacitly accepting North Korea as a nuclear state, that the public might see U.S. leaders as any U.S. leaders being weak because they don't want to go after North Korea, that they're accepting North Korea's nuclear weapons, and so that could actually hinder U.S. North Korea rapprochement. So there may be more of a hindrance factor than a helping factor in that scenario.
So this raises a related question. We often talk about U.S. policy. U.S. policymakers should do what they haven't done, and we've both worked on North Korea related stuff for a long time. So there's sort of people who view, we need to engage, and the North Koreans are sending signals, and those who think we should take a harder approach. But we don't often talk about sort of like the North Korean perspective. And so I don't want you necessarily to put yourself in the minds of the North Korean leadership because that's challenging in its own self. But from your perspective, if the U.S. public and U.S. leadership are aligned on that North Korea needs to give up its nuclear weapons, what implications does that potentially have then for North Korea itself and its own policy?
Yeah, I mean, in political science, they have this concept called two-level games, and so sometimes the domestic, leaders can use public opinion to further enhance their position or look more credible or stronger. So from North Korea's position, they'll say, well, there's no support from the public for denuclearization or not denuclearization, but for North Korea having nuclear weapons, or from the leaders, and so it's. From their perspective, from the North Koreans' perspective, it should make them more pessimistic. But again, I'm not sure even on the North Korea side if they pay attention to domestic opinion. I could see that they would want to maybe create some sort of dissent. And during the Trump period, maybe there was an attempt from Kim Jong-un to change their own narrative and get public opinion to be more sympathetic to your position. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
So one last thing I'd like to ask you before we move on to China about North Korea. So in addition to the tests, Kim Jong-un recently came out, and I've seen it kind of portrayed different ways, but in essence saying he wants North Korea to be a major nuclear power. Now, to what extent that really means, we can all maybe debate and parse his words. But announcements like that, do you think that has any impact on U.S. views?
Well, if there was a conference going on in Korea, and Jake Sullivan, the NSC director, was very clear that he said that they're going to push forward for denuclearization, that there are more sanctions that are in the works, against North Korea for their provocations. And so, if anything, it's, we're seeing the U.S. Coming up with even stronger language. So if Kim Jong-un declares that he's now a nuclear power, a nuclear state, if that's supposed to make the U.S. accept that proposition, then I think he needs to go back to the planning board, because it seems like South Korea and the U.S. are having none of this.
Okay. So I want to turn to China.
Sure.
The U.S. public maintains that China is the most significant threat for the United States. Or challenge, I guess, is probably the better word to use. And that countering China is of importance for U.S. interests in East Asia. Given the tensions between the United States and China and the obvious economic importance of China to the Korean economy, how can Korea manage its alliance commitments while maintaining or minimizing, the economic damage potentially from China? And we've seen this with the THAAD dispute and the informal sanctions that China put on South Korea.
This is always the challenge for South Korea in navigating relations between Beijing and Washington. Of course, President Yoon is really doubled down on the U.S. alliance, on the relationship, and also in Korea, there's very negative opinion towards China as well right now. But that being said, I still think South Koreans want to move cautiously. But in terms of how they should do this, I think one thing that I've argued, and in fact, in a paper that I wrote for KEI on South Korean regional architecture, is I think there's safety in numbers. And so one thing that South Korea can do is really align with other like-minded partners, of course, the United States, but then other U.S. allies in the region, Australia, Japan, Philippines, or participate in minilaterals. And that would make it harder, I think, for China to at least single out South Korea, of course, South Korea for taking actions which are ultimately for South Korea's own national interests. So that might be one approach. And there's also supposed to be support for, we'll have to see what this actually looks like, but certainly the Biden administration has often talked about, friend-shoring and supporting allies, creating supply chain resilience among allies. And so this is all supposed to benefit South Korea and other U.S. partners. So if there is any kind of coercion, then they'll have at least the backing of other countries. So ultimately, South Korea will have to make decisions that are best for its national interests, but it will have to weigh, what are the costs and benefits, and what are the risks involved by really ramping up relations with with the United States.
And I think it's interesting because, this is where IPEF, while there's been a lot of, and I think, legitimate criticisms of IPEF in terms of, it not being a binding agreement, could play an interesting role if done right. Trade Minister Ye talked earlier about how, in supply chains, the critical minerals issue aspect of it. And, he talked about, and I kind of added some additional detail on the EV battery situation in the U.S. So those EV batteries need, lithium, they need nickel, they need cobalt, and all these things. China is either the dominant, and by that I mean significantly dominant source of, either the mining or the refining of those minerals. And just to give one example, 60% of the world's lithium is mined in Australia. 50% is mined in Australia, but 60% is reprocessed in China. So right now we're in a situation to where even if you're mining lithium in Australia, a U.S. ally and partner, it's likely being refined in China. And South Korea and those battery firms are highly dependent on those supply chains through China. So if we're able to take and build some new refining capacity, perhaps in Australia, some other maybe Southeast Asian countries, in the U.S., Indonesia has a significant amount of some of the other minerals, like I think nickel, if I remember correctly. If we can do this through our discussions through IPEF about sort of restructuring supply chains and making them more resilient, it could reduce some of that dependency, which then reduces some of the Chinese leverage potentially on South Korea or other partners in the region as well.
Yeah, we're seeing a rewiring of supply chains, of trade and economic relations, and there is a lot of uncertainty and nervousness because we don't know what the actual implications may be, because there's these ripple effects. But at the same time, countries like South Korea can, if they play their cards right, they can also benefit from what's happening. So I know there's a lot of nervousness with these export controls being levied against China. But as you said, it's going to take some time to transition. But if as Koreans figure out how to rely less on China, there could be longer term gains.
I want to move to questions. Andy, could you bring up, if it's not already, yeah, you have it up, this one slide. Thank you. So one of the things that I think is interesting at looking at this is, countering the rise of China is viewed as the most important U.S. national interest in East Asia, but ultimately, defending U.S. allies and friends is close to a third, and also trade and economic issues are close to a third. So it's relatively equally balanced. Does this, clearly I think the countering China part, given the narrative that we've seen in the U.S., is probably not surprising. But when you look at that, is there anything that stands out to you, or do you think that's roughly how you would have expected the U.S. public to kind of view our interest in East Asia?
Yeah, seeing countering the rise of China first, usually it's when you frame, part of it has to do with this framing of good and bad, or democracies versus autocracies. And so that usually comes to mind first, because you think of what the country's national interest is, and usually it's easy when you think about an other or a target. And so that's why I think the rise of China comes up first as being the most important national interest. But we see defending U.S. friends and allies as being second. Trade and economics, I think, is at the bottom, because Americans don't really understand. It's harder to grasp, I think, the trade and economic dimensions, and you tend to think of security concerns first when you think of national interest. So I think it tracks around what I would expect.
Andy, I want to bring you into the conversation if you have any questions, or if there's any questions from the audience that you'd like to go ahead and share with us.
Well, of course. I would have been content to keep watching this because it's such a fascinating discussion. Always a pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Ya. I did want to bring to attention what we touched on a bit earlier regarding U.S. interest in North Korean denuclearization and what that could mean for the Trans-Pacific alliance between the United States and South Korea. We've seen, we've talked about how U.S. public attitudes changed regarding North Korea, and specifically, this may be a relativist argument, but with the other things coming up, like Ukraine, China, interest in North Korean denuclearization has dropped to a degree, both in our survey and in the Chicago Council survey. That being said, when South Korea sees these numbers and South Koreans think about what is the U.S. commitment to actually facing North Korean nuclear weapons and capabilities. Obviously, we've established here that American commitments to South Korea hasn't necessarily changed. But with the growing argument within South Korea that South Korea should pursue its own independent deterrent, and seeing these patterns, how do you think that dynamic could turn out? Especially with this kind of conflict between U.S. commitment to denuclearization versus U.S. commitment to South Korea, if South Korea decides that it cannot trust the United States to uphold its commitments.
Yeah, so we've definitely seen this come up, especially last month when there was defense meetings between U.S. and South Korea. And you're right that the commitment to South Korea defense has not U.S. support for South Korean defense has not changed, especially at the elite level. It's gotten stronger. This poll, shows maybe it's hard to say. It actually looks comparable between 21 and 22, but Americans want North Koreans to give up its nuclear capabilities. But I think the best thing for the U.S. is really to keep reassuring the South Koreans at the political level. North Koreans are demanding nuclear. Either returning U.S. tactical nuclear weapons to the peninsula or developing their own weapons. And that's unlikely to gain any acceptance or traction in the U.S. But I do think the United States is open to maybe providing more transparency and information about its own nuclear strategy for the peninsula. And so there's an ongoing ongoing dialogue. But I understand from the South Korea position why, though. If you're the president, or let's say you're the defense minister of South Korea, and you see all these provocations, an ICBM launch, and a nuclear test, and you're asking, well, what can you actually do? How can you defend us from North Korea if there's a nuclear attack? And the only thing a South Korean leader can say is, well, at the end of the day, we just have to trust in the U.S. nuclear umbrella or extended deterrence. That sounds dissatisfying in some ways as a Korean, because you want to be able to say, we can do more, but in some ways, you're saying you got to rely on the U.S. But that's why, we've got to remember it's, the militaries are intertwined, that they work together. And that's why I think we are seeing very robust and even a strengthening of military cooperation on the peninsula. So it's an ongoing conversation, but I still think there is ample support from the U.S. on the question of keeping South Koreans safe from a North Korean nuclear attack.
Well, on that note, I believe that concludes
I think we have one question from the audience.
Of course. I believe we touched on this a bit before, but given Korea's reticence in challenging China, and I guess this can be a lightning round since we did cover it a little bit. How could that challenge U.S. ROK military cooperation? I believe we spoke briefly with context to Taiwan and the Taiwan contingency, but I guess more broadly.
Yeah. So on defense of the Korean Peninsula, there's no issue there, but there are these questions about things like strategic flexibility, meaning what if you use U.S. forces in Korea outside of the Korean Peninsula? How accepting would Koreans be? So I think that's what this question is getting at, as there's greater challenges. And that's where the Taiwan issue comes into place. But I don't know how, South Korea has brought up Taiwan, and there's, U.S. in the Biden-Yoon statement, in the Biden-Moon statement as well, too. So I think Koreans are beginning to think about that issue. And yes, the U.S. is going to expect support from any of its allies if there is a contingency. But I'm not too concerned right now, because there is such constant dialogue. But I do think that even for South Korea, they are beginning to change and see the need. They're going to come out with an Indo-Pacific strategy very soon. And if they want to be engaged in the region and with other allies and partners, it also means contributing to the wider defense of the region, not just the Korean Peninsula.
Right. Well, thank you for that again. Of course, just to conclude now, I believe it is getting quite late in South Korea for our viewers over there. Well, thank you again to Minister Yohan Koo, Ms. Jenna Gibson, and Dr. Andrew Yeh for your invaluable time and insight. And to all of you who joined us today virtually, you can find the full report again on our website at keia.org, along with our other publications and events. You can also keep up to date on new video content from KEI by liking this video and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Next week, on Thursday, December 8th, KEI will be hosting an event on how to understand North Korea's satellite imagery. Please refer again to our website at www.keia.org to find more information on how to RSVP. We're looking forward to seeing you there.